Hello and welcome, everyone. Nice to see you all here today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Fisher, and I am the Assistant Director at the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. AIHP just celebrated its 84th anniversary with the launch of our new digital library. Please check it out on our website, aihp.org, where you can also see more upcoming events. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Zachary Dorner, Assistant Professor in History at the University of Maryland. Professor Dorner is a historian of early modern Anglophone Atlantic world who specializes in the histories of empire, exchange, and medicine. His book, Merchants of Medicine, The Commerce and Coercion of Health in Britain's Long 18th Century, is the recipient of the 2024 AIHP Kremers Award, which recognizes an outstanding publication in the history of pharmacy. And I hope you can all see this. Let's see if I can get this right. Here's his award. At the conclusion of Dr. Dorner's talk, there will be time for a question and answer period. Dr. Dorner.
Thank you, Beth. And I should say, that is an incredible award. Not what I was expecting, though very apropos. It's incredible.
Great.
So thank you. No, thank you, Beth, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. And again, I want to thank everyone at the Institute for their engagement with my work and for recognizing it with the 2024 Kremers Award. The AIHP, given the scholarship it supports, and Edward Kremers Scholarship in particular, have been influential in my development as a historian. I remember reading Kremers' work as a grad student, so many years ago now, and it's really, really stuck with me. So I'm genuinely honored and glad to see my name alongside the others who have been granted this award for their work. So my talk today offers an overview of some of the findings of my book that you mentioned, Beth, Merchants of Medicines, and it considers what can happen, and it focuses on a particular part of that, considering the talk considers what can happen when people are viewed as interchangeable patients. And then I end with sort of discussing where my work is now going towards a second book that I'm working on. So I'm going to start today with an archive. There we go. So about a decade ago, the ledgers and letter books of the Plough Court Pharmacy, you can see some images of, in the bottom right, an 18th century, or an engraving of the 18th century facade of this pharmacy in London. Top right, a 19th century view of this pharmacy as it has grown in industrial scale. And on the left there, a 21st century image of GlaxoSmithKline's global headquarters in West London. So about a decade ago, when I was doing my research, the ledgers and letter books of Plough Court Pharmacy resided inside GlaxoSmithKline's global headquarters in Brentford, West London, where the sort of researcher archive desk they prepared for me was simply a cubicle in what was otherwise a center of customer service representatives. The 18th and 19th century records portrayed one of London's busiest and most successful pharmacies that supplied the Royal Navy, East India Company, sugar estates in Jamaica and Barbados, and the Pennsylvania Hospital, alongside local hospitals and customers with medicines manufactured from a variety of chemicals and imported drugs. And these records ended up with GSK because one of Plough Court's successor companies was acquired by Glaxo Laboratories in 1958. And GSK itself today is the result of a 2000 merger of Glaxo Wellcome and SmithKline Beecham. Henry Wellcome established Burroughs Wellcome and Company in 1880 to sell medicines across the British Empire, the proceeds of which were used to establish the Wellcome Trust, one of the world's largest medical charities, and the Wellcome Collection, one of the foremost repositories of material related to the history of medicine, not coincidentally where a lot of the research for this book took place as well. And more recently, GSK and Sanofi received one of the largest US government contracts to produce a COVID-19 vaccine under Operation Warp Speed. So again, I hope you're seeing, and I'll come back to this, right, that this constellation of state, pharmacy, military, health, right, as commerce is already forming at this institutional level in the 18th century. GSK's polished glass and steel building is a far cry, at least in appearance, from plow court. But it's not that far removed if we look at the commercial ties between medicine manufacturers and the armed forces, penal institutions, governments, and extractive enterprises that have continued to shape the priorities and infrastructures of healthcare since the 18th century. And I hope you leave this talk today with an understanding of why the presence of these records at GSK makes a lot of sense based on the system of medicine production, distribution, and consumption that emerged from a particular configuration of overseas European empire, long-distance trade, and bound labor in the 18th century. This relationship, again, between overseas European empire, long-distance trade, and bound labor forms the bedrock of my first book, Merchants of Medicines, which, after describing that relationship, goes on to explore the ways it contributed to the hardening of emergent categories of bodily difference based on skin color, what would in the 19th century be termed race. Also how it contributed to the development of credit instruments, the spread of population thinking, and several other things as well. Later in the talk, I'll discuss how these themes and unresolved questions stemming from them have motivated my attention to labor and care work in my next book project. Bringing together the histories of medicine and commerce in a long-distance framework helps us see that during the long 18th century, imperial administrators, plantation owners, medical practitioners, merchants, and consumers yoked a population-level view of healthcare to the goals of empire, uniting them to turn people into patients on a broader scale than ever before. This shift involved epistemic changes in the ways people conceived of their health and very material changes in the production, delivery, and markets for European medicines. In other words, we cannot tell a story of a globalizing medical trade or of, quote, modern medicine itself without examining empire's role in incentivizing the transformation of people into recipients of increasingly mass-produced medicines. And to do so, to explain that shift, I must turn to the body and specifically the individualized view of it that had begun to change by the time the British political economy began to take health more seriously at the turn of the 18th century. So in Europe then, for millennia, staying healthy meant achieving one's optimal balance of the four humors: phlegm, choler, blood, and black bile, four humors. And sort of what that balance meant varied according to one's unique bodily composition of them, one's constitution. And this could be affected by environment, bodily events, etc., that would disrupt it. Health in this framework then was a matter of internal balance rather than one necessarily of cures. Medicines that were ingested were prescribed to help rebalance the humors, not necessarily to cure or assuage a particular ailment. Right here you can see a few diagrams of the relationship of the four humors and how that might contribute to one's unique constitutional balance and how different combinations of them were believed to influence one's temperament and health. Right, so something sort of seemingly as innocuous as eating too many cucumbers, for example. If you had a phlegmatic constitution, right, cold and moist humors, right, that could disrupt your health if you ate too many pickles, for example. Right, so a night of carousing or a sexual encounter, even a foul mood, could disrupt one's humors and thereby lead to sickness. Within this physiological view, health and illness were not strictly oppositional, nor were avoiding pain or curing an ailment necessarily the goals of healthy living. Rather, the aim was to help or was to keep or restore balance, which required a personalized interpretation of bodily signs, followed by diagnoses and prescriptions to re-equilibrate one's humors. So I just want everyone to sort of take a second and think for a moment about how laborious such an approach would be, especially when deployed at the scales demanded by early modern empires, right? Thinking about a single surgeon for hundreds of sailors on a naval vessel or on a merchant seaman or something like that. The humoral focus on individual health ran up against the labor demands of empire during the 17th and 18th centuries, when attempts to wrest control of territory and access the real and imagined natural bounty it offered provoked large-scale movements of people. More than 12 million African captives were forced onto ships across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage. More than 3 million people under the English or British flag during that period. Between 1688 and 1815, the Royal Navy mobilized roughly 500,000 men, volunteer and impressed, in wars against France and Spain. Impressed sailors comprise anywhere from 1 to 2/3 of this total, putting them a distant second to enslaved Africans among forced labor groups in the 18th century British Empire. The army and trading companies sent scores more overseas to face new disease environments, while other Europeans, including those bound as indentured servants, traveled to new places where their bodies seemed in danger of transformation in foreign landscapes and under unfamiliar stars. And across the Atlantic world in this period, then, endemic disease made healthcare a daily concern, as fevers, particularly malaria and yellow fever, already had a long history of inflicting severe losses on military expeditions and settlement schemes in the Americas. And here we have an image of several British ships sailing into the harbor of St. Pierre on the island of Martinique. So during the 9 Years' War, so there's one example I'm going to highlight here to illustrate sort of the changing thinking behind medicines for groups of people in this period. During the 9 Years' War, from 1688 to 1697, an abundance of sick men overwhelmed the English Army's medical service, while disease disrupted successive naval expeditions to the Caribbean. The mortality and morbidity observed by imperial officials constituted a crisis of authority that imperiled the war effort in the eyes of a nascent English-reading public. Naval forces, for example, abandoned an attack on the French island of Martinique in 1693 after fever decimated sailors across the fleet. Soon after, in 1695, several ships undermanned due to disease sank on their return voyages from the region. And based on these military failures, the Lords of the Admiralty sought more economical and reliable remedies that departed from the humoral logics that had apparently failed them during the war. They sought medicines that could be applied more broadly for curative instead of rebalancing purposes. In other words, the Admiralty sought to simply, effectively, and in bulk treat the diseases sailors suffered in a range of locations. And this example from the 1690s is a notable but hardly a unique case, where we can see this logic appear within the Army or Navy around this time. And apothecaries, druggists, and chemists, right, these emergent producers of medicines at scale, jumped at the opportunity to lobby the Admiralty for a contract to provide such items. Recognizing that the Navy could invest substantial sums, and regular sums, I might add, for a contract to provide such items, in efforts to keep its personnel alive, right? So it wasn't just the sums, but the regularity of a government contract were both very enticing to apothecaries, chemists, and druggists. As other historians and I've shown, right, the spending on medical treatment and on medicines in particular very much rose right in the 18th century. And this isn't to say that, right, an emphasis on medicines is a new thing. Medicinal plants had already entered calculations of state power going back to Francis Drake's promotion of sassafras, but now medical care itself was becoming a factor in political economy. As my 2019 article in the Journal of British Studies argued, by the mid-18th century, medicinal plants and medicines made from them had become integral to visions of British imperial might vis-a-vis its European rivals. And this manifested in various schemes to procure or steal, if you will, valuable plants from New Spain and establish botanical gardens in what is now the state of Georgia or Jamaica, for example. So under these circumstances, right, and these pressures and these changes aren't coming just from the military realm, right? They're also coming from other realms of sort of medical thought, but I'm focusing on the military here. Under these circumstances, then, the long-standing idea that ill health came from internal imbalance of the humors began to see competition from another view, that diseases had essential qualities of their own and attacked the body from outside, to put it simply. And here we have a print by the satirist Thomas Rowlandson from the late 18th century that illustrates this idea nicely. With egg, right, so the blue creature, and fever, the spiky one in the middle, menacing this man as he tries to warm himself by the fire, right? These are no longer internal imbalances of the humors, but are, in effect, right, monsters threatening things unto themselves. And this idea carried many practical advantages and profitable opportunities. It made it simpler and more cost-effective, at least in theory, to manage the health of groups, especially those such as bound laborers or impressed seamen who had less of a choice about what went into their bodies and often had fewer, right, medical practitioners assigned to their care or oversight. It contributed to the infrastructure of a commercializing medical marketplace for curative products across Europe and its colonies. And seeing illness as an ontological matter in this way, right, as something exterior of the body, no longer as an internal physiological one, helped popularize medicines that could be taken specifically for the treatment of particular diseases with the goal of curing them, hence the term specifics that arose for such remedies. This way of thinking and new ways of making and marketing medicines in this period enabled a much wider reach of such products. Here we can see some contemporary advertisements and printed texts by notable people, even such as Robert Boyle, talking about the idea of specifics and marketing them in print. Printed texts by notable researchers such as Sydenham, Boerhaave, Linnaeus, classified and characterized diseases, and specifics were taught in Europe's most prominent medical schools. And tests with supposed specifics were carried out on sick and wounded seamen at naval hospitals. And the idea found advocates among some of the most renowned scientific writers of the day, as well as those trying to sell medicines in London and Britain's emergent medical marketplace. And large laboring populations, such as those on a sugar estate or a ship of the line, could be more conveniently treated with medicines designed materially and conceptually to be administered to groups of people in this way. Government officials, merchants, political economists had also begun to think of people in terms of populations in this period, as historians including Jennifer Morgan and Ted McCormick have shown in recent work on the origins of demography. Population level thinking then can be found emerging simultaneously from different places at this time, right? The accounting and the calculus of the transatlantic slave trade, political arithmetic, and medicine. Though, of course, these were all linked in practice, right? A lot of the concerns of these different fields overlapped in practice. Healthcare that attended to people at the group or population level could thus rather simply be integrated into political economic designs that were adopting similar logics at the time. So as a result of a more robust and cohesive sector for manufacturing medicines in Britain, which I illustrate sort of at the beginning of the book, and expanding markets for specifics abroad, British medicine exports rose exponentially during the 18th century, achieving a coherence not yet seen in terms of exports in particular. And here are two views of the medicine trade. On the left is a couple examples of the expanding epistolary correspondence of apothecaries and chemists across the Atlantic world in this period from two examples, Joseph Cruttendon and Thomas Corbin. And on the right, you can see a graph charting official exports of medicines from London by weight in thousands of pounds weight on the left. So by 1770, right before the precipitous drop-off caused by the American Revolution on the graph, the medicine trade stretched across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and was the fastest growing of any of the trades in British manufactures, especially after the removal of export duties on medicines in 1720. And again, I want to stress that medicines were considered, at least by British customs officials, as a manufacture. And I'll explain sort of the distinction of that coming up. But again, medicines were items manufactured, combined, given added value from the chemical work with drugs. So this nearly 5% growth rate amounts to quite a large increase over the decades, from a 5-year average of roughly 190,000 pounds weight per year from 1740 to 44 to more than 1 million pounds weight per year from 1770 to 1774. And that's an increase of nearly 400%. And the increase, or the result, is even larger if I were to move the starting point earlier. And as you can see in this map of exports from London until 1780, the black bars sort of correspond to volume of exports that those destinations received from London. It's sites, it's colonial sites, so it's sites of colonial warfare and large-scale agriculture that constituted major markets for these medicines. Right, we see medicines ending up at places like Fort St. George via the British East India Company in South Asia, right, in Quebec, where there is a hospital circled there, right? And so to create this data, I compiled this export data from the Treasury's official customs ledgers, while other data in the book about the expansion of the medicine trade in Britain I extracted from fire insurance policies. And medicine exports usually followed once British forces captured a territory from a European rival, such as in the case of Martinique and Guadeloupe. After the invasion of Martinique in 1762, so again, much after the failed invasion that I spoke about earlier, 4,282 pounds weight of medicines reached the island before it was given back to France after treaty negotiations in 1763. Similarly, Guadeloupe received an average of 13,000 pounds weight of medicines yearly during the British occupation of the French sugar island from 1759 until 1763. And again, the classification of medicines here as apothecary ware and as a manufacturer in the customs ledger. And so what were these medicines, right? You might be wondering, or if you're here at this talk at the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy, maybe you already have a good sense of it, but just to be thorough, I'll briefly sort of define that. Right, and somewhat of an oversimplification, right? These medicines I'm largely speaking about encompass items produced from a variety of animal, vegetable, mineral, and chemical ingredients that could have been collected or produced locally in Britain or imported across vast distances. Although often these ingredients, called drugs, could also be taken as a remedy on their own in a way called the simple. So again, I like to think of drugs as the ingredients that could also be taken on their own, whereas medicines or compound remedies, today what we might call a pharmaceutical, are the sort of manufactured value-added version that has combined several of these drugs. And this is a naval medicine chest illustrative of the range of drugs on board some ships before the move toward sort of more simplified bulk medicines. Right, and some of these medicines that found purchase included tinctures of bitter cinchona bark, pills of aromatic camphor and nitric acid, or perhaps pills made from antimony and bread. There are also all sorts of cordials and elixirs that involve distilling various drugs and preserving them in spirits or adding plenty of sugar. And these medicines were increasingly produced in bulk in chemical laboratories across London, which also you can kind of think of as laboratories, but they're not really interested in sort of scientific exploration in ways that we might associate with laboratories today, but you can kind of think of them as sort of a chemical workshop or manufactory in some ways. So they're made in these kinds of spaces across London and Europe, financed increasingly through joint stock arrangements with partners who all buy into the arrangement. Many operate on credit and government contracts. And many of these medicines could be purchased by a customer off the street by the dose. And with advances in glass production, small quantities could be prepackaged for export to the kinds of locations I mentioned before. And these kinds of activities and business arrangements are indicative of the category of medicine manufacturer and distributor I call merchants of medicines in my book, which also is the source of the title. And we can talk about efficacy or whether these substances likely had what would today be recognized as pharmacological properties. But the fact of the matter really is that early modern medicinal substances were believed to work and often provoked physiological responses because they included sugar, alcohol, aromatic spices, in addition to compounds that do have pharmacological properties based on today's standards. So whether you look from a political economic view, a commercial one, or even a physical one, these medicines were valuable, held to be important to the project of empire, and were felt to do something. And perhaps most importantly, the sick and the dying at the time hoped they would do something. The political, economic, and mental components of health made it such a pressing issue in the 18th century, one that stretched across great distances, concerned scores of people, both free and unfree, as well as mobilized a lot of capital. Faced with easily communicable and infectious diseases that could move quickly through a proximal population, medical practitioners found prepackaged medicines designed to treat a certain disease much simpler and cost-effective than the more time-consuming and patient-centered process of reading someone's humoral balance, especially in contexts of massive power imbalances, such as those that structured slave societies across the Atlantic world. And again, given the emergent system for the production and distribution of such commodities, they were more accessible to people in these colonial spaces than ever. So now I'm going to pivot and move on to talk about some of the implications of this accessibility of medicines sort of that operate in this sort of theoretical mode. And to do so, I'm going to focus on the Caribbean as a destination for these medicines, and particularly the British West Indies. So with specifics then, under this sort of aegis or like theory of specifics, a medicine exported from London would have a similar effect on a person regardless of who, noble, poor, free, bound, man, woman, child, or where, Europe, Americas, Asia, they were. In other words, the effectiveness of the medicines need not be sensitive to the idiosyncrasies of a particular person or a particular place. And this was kind of a radical idea for the time, not just because of what it implies about, social class or about human sameness, but also because it flew in the face of long-standing ideas that certain diseases and their remedies appeared together in particular places. This is very sort of new thinking and sort of challenging thinking for some from a variety of levels. And by such logic then, right, this logic of specifics, a Chinese emperor could find relief from a fever with a tincture of cinchona, just as would a cooper in London, an African captive at sea, or a nurse in Boston. So consider how convenient this would seem to a surgeon on a Navy vessel or a physician on a sugar estate. Instead of examining each person individually to decide a prescription, he, and in these institutional settings, right, the practitioners I'm talking about are almost always a he, could identify a disease and then prescribe a single medicine for the entire group, thus reducing individual attention while theoretically protecting the labor force. And this is the promise of specifics boiled down. But it also suggests something else. This is where I'm going to now. The idea of a universal therapeutic body. So it might seem strange to think of a universal therapeutic body in this period, given the ideas of inherent bodily difference that were being formulated in the 18th century. But it is important to note that these ideas were not yet the hardened categories that comprised the scientific racism of the 19th century. And here I'm thinking about Soom and Seth's work on the subject. These categories and their purported evidence were still very much in flux at this time, particularly when faced with the practical exigencies of empire. For example, surgeons in the South Sea Company turned to the same medicines for European sailors and African captives during long slave trading voyages in the face of deadly disease outbreaks. Even in spaces, right, that depended on rigid, violent, racialized hierarchy, crews and captives received the same medicines for a bloody flux that raged on board the St. Michael as it lay at anchor off the island of Madagascar in 1726, for example. So for a time then in the 18th century, I found, medicines were able to transcend nascent ideas of difference, because of the convenience and utility they offered. Other historians have similarly identified the turn toward a universal body, particularly in terms of scientific or medical testing. On the Schiebinger has shown, for example, that European medical practitioners and academics viewed black bodies as valid sources of medical information applicable to all patients at the turn of the 19th century, an idea that would be contested later in the century, particularly by physicians and medical studies coming out of the United States in the 19th century. All right, so back to the Caribbean. Decades of large-scale, intensive agriculture and connection to the transatlantic slave trade created a disease environment on the sugar islands of the Caribbean, more conducive to pathogens that threatened the labor upon which the islands' economies were built, even if they weren't understood as such at the time. Marshes that formed after the removal of forests for cane fields provided excellent habitat for mosquitoes, as did the standing water generated by plantation machinery. Monkeys brought to the Antilles from West Africa between 1640 and 1690 had given yellow fever another vector with no natural predators on the island. And these disease vectors found an enslaved population vulnerable to pathogens for a variety of reasons. The average number of enslaved persons on a sugar estate in the British West Indies, this is an image of a sugar estate from a French island, but again, you can see sort of the layout and also keep an eye on the hospital identified here, which was both a space of convalescence and medicine, but also right tied to that, there is the threat of overdosing, confinement, and restraint. The average number of enslaved persons on a sugar estate in the British West Indies nearly doubled from the 1740s to the 1780s by some measures. The island of Barbados, which features prominently in my book, the island's overall enslaved population rose from about 50,000 in the year 1700 to more than 90,000 in 1770, while the free white population stayed at about 15 to 17,000 people during that period. So as settlements in tropical areas supported larger populations of greater density, observers' concerns about health mounted, and new genres of tropical health and plantation manuals followed that amplified the promise of specifics and imported medicines more generally for assuaging these concerns about health. Acclimating to the climate and disease environment of the islands typically claimed 15 to 20% of recently arrived captives as well. And in this context, it is often difficult to separate the strands of plantation mortality and morbidity in the 18th century Caribbean, given the archive that remains for us to study. The physical degradations and depredations of the plantation exacerbated endemic disease through injuries, malnutrition, psychological trauma, to become functionally indistinguishable with each other. And looking at the British Caribbean as a whole, life expectancy remained less than 40 years, especially for the enslaved in areas of sugar cultivation. Though disease, right, we know, ultimately acknowledged neither rank nor skin in the Caribbean. But male and female field workers, for example, were recorded as sick or disabled for much of their working lives, though again, right, these sources are coming from, right, the perspective of white enslavers, so we need to recognize as the lenses through which these data have been collected. But again, it should give a sense, right, of sort of the pervasiveness and commonality and sort of ubiquity of disease and ill health in the region in this period. So given the incredible mortality and morbidity rates and the capital investment in this region, British medicines counted among a sugar estate's annual expenses, alongside other provisions such as grains, tools, and clothing. So again, here we see an order for supplies, an annual order for supplies for Golden Grove Estate on the island of Jamaica. And just as giving us, you can take a look, see some of the things they're ordering on the rightmost page is a specific section for medicines and utensils. And I'll focus in on that in a moment. Based on, and again, Golden Grove is located on the sort of east side. I'll come back to the order in one moment. On the east, sort of the southeast side of the island of Jamaica, you can see down in the map the town of Bath, renowned for its medicinal waters. And to the right of that, to the east of that, I should say, you can see a small dot for Golden Grove along a river nearby other estates. So based on export data, Barbados and Jamaica constituted two of the principal export markets for British medicines in the 18th century. Shipments could cost hundreds of pounds sterling, and these were often debts paid by the future value of plantation produce being shipped to London, right? So cash isn't actually exchanging hands. The proceeds of the medicine trade depended on the successful large-scale plantation agriculture. And here are some of the medicines and utensils ordered for Golden Grove in particular. In many ways, then, medicine easily fit, right, slid right into the prevailing rhythms of transatlantic commerce and bound labor. And many ailments on the plantation proved resistant to available medical interventions, though that did not dull the desire for them to work. Common ailments included fevers and fluxes, as well as ulcerated limbs sustained because of deficient diet, lack of suitable footwear, labor-related incidents, and the routine violence of the plantation. Enslavers stockpiled imported medicines and were expected to administer remedies as part of managing an estate, even if they had no formal medical training. Often they tasked skilled Afro-Caribbean attendants with much of the daily care. In other cases, overseers or bookkeepers even dispensed medicines, having read about them in a manual. Plantation doctors also circulated, who were typically paid per annum, per head, for healthcare provided to the enslaved men, women, and children on various estates where they had such contracts. In one case, Alexander Johnston claimed to have provided care to over 1,400 people, enslaved people, on 9 Jamaican estates in the year 1770 as part of what he called a, quote, insurance policy. And the term insurance policy here reflects from another angle what the export figures already show, that imported medicines formed an important part of the plantation economy in the eyes of medical practitioners, planters, merchants, and imperial officials. What enslaved patients thought of them, however, remains largely out of view, although some recent work gives us ways to think about that question. The perceived efficacy and portability of specifics made applying them relatively simple in theory, though forcible means could be used in practice to ensure they were ingested. For the enslaved persons subjected to medicines in this manner, the experience was anything but simple. In the 3 months of one plantation doctor's journal in 1791, we are confronted with many instances of the application of European-style powders, unguents, liniments, and other substances to the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children on the island of Barbados. To name some of these men, women, or at least they were called Beniba, Ned, Sue, Maya, and I could go on. The doctor in this case, Barwick Bruce, came from a family that had lived on the island of Barbados for several generations and formed a key link between Ploughcourt Pharmacy that I mentioned earlier and several large-scale sugar estates on the island in the second half of the 18th century. He personally imported and purchased large quantities of medicines from Ploughcourt that he then resold and applied to enslaved people on several plantations here. So these blue circles relate to some of the denser population hubs in Barbados at the time, and these green circles are estates that Barwick Bruce visited and sold medicines, provided attendance for both the free white inhabitants as well as the enslaved inhabitants of those places. So in June 1791, so one example, in June 1791, this Dr. Barwick Bruce sent several ounces of flour of sulfur, a cheap powder used for cutaneous conditions. Today it's used as an antiseptic and antifungal. To Edge Hill Plantation, it's the sort of second green circle down from the top in the sort of the southern end of St. Thomas Parish, to, quote, rub the yellow spots, close quote, that had appeared on the skin of many of the enslaved persons there. Yet in this case, he did not administer the remedies himself, right? He only He did not accompany the medicine, he just sent it along. So we can ask the question then, who would have applied, right, rubbed this powder and where on the skin? Was it with consent? Would it have hurt? In this example, and really every instance of plantation healthcare I read, reminds me of Hortense Spiller's observation that I paraphrase here. The enslaved experienced few distinctions among curative, intimate, or violent forms of touch. With routines of confinement, punishment, and surveillance, medicines comprised a method of healthcare designed to enforce discipline and productivity in the Caribbean, which also constituted another way of inscribing enslaved status onto some and not others in these spaces. Oops, one more plantation. So here's an excerpt from Barwick Bruce's practical journal, the journal he kept of all of his visits. So on May 11, 1791, for example, Bruce recommended for little Maya's child, you can see here, a purgative pill of white magnesium ipecac twice a day, and a preparation of powdered alum, a sweet astringent salt of sulfuric acid, alumina, and ammonia in molasses to touch the mouth with a feather frequently. Right? And again, we don't know the routine, but we can sort of imagine what it might have been like. What kind of bird was the feather from? Who would have applied it? As well as the ordeal for the small, unnamed to us, right, child. This kind of preparation was commonly used for intermittent fevers and ailments of the bowels. It was sometimes used as a cheaper alternative to cinchona bark, one of the most well-known and therefore pricey febrifuges at the time. It had also been recorded on other plantation manuals as a treatment for dysentery in children. And it is examples like these that have prompted me to explore new questions about the labor, intimacy, and value of care work in the later 18th century in my second book. And this move also reflects nascent work in the history of science, emphasizing science as work and calling for a new labor history of science. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I need to return to the first book to finish up the point I'm trying to make. While the notion of universal effectiveness of specifics underlying much of this practice might seem to obliterate rather than reinforce hierarchies between individuals, it actually enabled a new form of systematic exclusion by the end of the 18th century. So in the face of supposedly universal medications, differing medical outcomes for certain groups could easily be used to justify emergent racial ideologies across the slave societies of the Atlantic world. So under the coercive conditions of plantation slavery, disparity in health outcomes were common, right? Responses to a fever for one group would not be the same responses to a fever for another group, right? Given disparities in diet, clothing, living conditions, exposure to violence, all of that. Those disparities, however, were often attributed to racial pathologies rather than the institutional deprivation and violence of enslaved labor, right? They're not thinking about externalities. They're not thinking about confounding variables. They're sort of thinking about differing outcomes in terms of pathologies based on skin color. So again, this might seem like a contradictory idea, that such a radical idea of sameness, held by specifics, would lead to new ideas of human difference. But it boils down to this question of what happens when an expectation of sameness, or at least of sort of comparable efficacy of a medicine, is disabused on a sugar plantation, right? How are those visible material differences justified or understood by those reliant on racialized hierarchy? Within the framework of imperial healthcare, medicines purported to act in similar, regular ways, thus offered a vector for ideas of human difference to shape routines of healthcare and the interpretations and really justifications of unequal outcomes in those spaces. So here is sort of the title page and a key passage from one of these plantation manuals I've been referring to, just to sort of illustrate this point I'm making. So one influential manual for plantation management, Dr. Collins' Practical Rules for the Management and Medical Treatment of Negro Slaves in the Sugar Colonies, published in 1803, articulated an idea of physiological difference marked by skin color, but based on differential outcomes, both of outcomes of disease and outcomes of treatment on Caribbean plantations. Dysentery, according to Collins, affected those with black skin more severely than those with white. Quote, so that the two varieties of men seem to pass out of life by two different outlets. You can see that passage there. And though he differentiated between the severity of ailments suffered by those of Afro-Caribbean and European descent in this way, and left out so many other factors, Collins lamented that, quote, the knife of the anatomist, however, has never been able to detect, and this is sort of my bracket, any sort of differing internal organization of the bodies. So in other words, though he based his belief in the inherent bodily difference of people with varying skin color on what he thought were empirical observations of how they responded to disease and treatment in the Caribbean, Collins could find no physiological basis for such difference from his reading of anatomy texts or perhaps his own forays into dissection. Again, Collins's work here is only one of the many that comprise the emergent genres of plantation manuals in tropical medicine. The conclusions of authors such as Collins, as well as Samuel Martin, William Belgrove, Patrick Kine, Clement Keynes, that the enslaved could tolerate stronger medicines or larger doses in the face of such disparate outcomes, normalized a logic of overdosing and forced medication for enslaved men, women, and children that also accrued profits to those who provided or sold the medicines. Lacking physical evidence, however, as Collins did not stop such authors from propagating racial ideologies, even as they insisted that their texts would make plantations healthier and more productive during a period concerned with, quote, ameliorating conditions in the British Caribbean at the close of the 18th century, right? So this dawn of the period of abolitionism and calls to end the transatlantic slave trade, attention on the health of enslaved people increased as well, and medicines are a part of it. And again, I want to stress that these are hardly fringe ideas at the time. Rather, ideas about the pain tolerance of African-descended mothers or the need for higher doses of medicines for those with dark skin were taken up by canonical medical texts across Europe and the United States, leading to pernicious medical misconceptions, to put it mildly, that contribute to differential African-American mortality rates today even. Again, a few headlines that I teach with pertaining to these lingering misconceptions and their real medical consequences today. So these plantation manuals I just spoke about illustrate that at the very moment when medical practitioners gained access to bulk manufactured medicines and began prescribing them with greater authority, one strand of racialized ideas about bodily difference was starting to gain legitimacy within the institutions underwriting those medical developments and profiting from ideas of human sameness embodied by specifics. The notion that migratory and vulnerable populations presented lucrative opportunities for medicine sales has remained, as have the take this for that and one-size-fits-all approaches inaugurated within the early modern empires. Healthcare also emerged as a means of regulating behavior and changing perceptions of people's bodies. And as I discuss in Merchants of Medicines and elsewhere, forces of empire, subjugation, and exploitation conspired to turn a more nuanced, individualized approach to health, not without its own misconceptions and power dynamics, of course, into a more all or nothing, generalized and interchangeable population view of sickness and treatment, more bent toward curative measures in service of productivity than wellness. It may look different over time, but in the 18th century, we can already identify the familiar constellation of state, labor, war, taxes, and wealth that supports many of modern medicine's logics. Though I should add, I'm particularly fascinated by a new turn towards targeted therapeutics today that offer more personalized treatment options for those who can afford them and for certain kinds of cancer, which makes me wonder about a return toward a more individualized, unique therapeutic body for some at least. So As I hope you've gathered from my talk so far, the confluence of the histories of commerce and medicine is a fruitful one that has much to say not simply about either commerce or medicine, but rather about entire systems and structures, about states and institutions, about human difference, and even about the ways people conceive of themselves and others. And to circle back where I began this talk, it shouldn't be surprising that the business archive of an 18th century pharmacy now resides at the global headquarters of GlaxoSmithKline, because some of the fundamental logics that underwrite big pharma and approaches to bulk healthcare provision were inaugurated under the circumstances of 18th century European empire. So now I just want to conclude my talk by gesturing and pointing toward where this work is going next. So this conclusion then, right, about these sort of connections and lingering ideas and threads from the 18th century at the conclusion of my first book, raised for me the question of what is owed to the most vulnerable and precarious populations that comprised empires. And historically, what choices did such people have for their care? So historians of early modern England and medicine have, of course, asked versions of these questions for decades. Right? Mary Feazell, Margaret Pelling, Elaine Leong come prominently to mind. But my new book aims to answer these versions of these questions within a transatlantic comparative frame that links conversations about care to conversations about human welfare, poor relief, and labor. So here's a few images from my sort of illustrating some of the examples and thinking from my second book titled Caring for the Precariat, which is in progress. So this explores a moment in the later 18th and early 19th century when I found expectations of care were beginning to narrow to the relatively limited conceptions that have typified institutional forms of care in more recent eras. This book centers prisons, plantations, military hospitals, orphanages, refugee camps as space where care was needed, given, and profited from. And in these spaces, right, we could see the top left is the facade of a debtor's prison in London. The bottom left is Haslar Hospital, one of the Royal Navy's major naval hospitals on the south coast of England in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the right is the Chatham chest, so the physical chest that held the money for an early pension scheme or disability insurance, if you want to define it that way, run by the British Navy as well. And again, in these spaces, vulnerable populations, vulnerable people, often received what looked like state-provided medical care at no cost to them. Yet this aid hid the true price of that care for the patients and for the providers. Right? For example, the British Navy provided some of the earliest European disability pension or insurance in recognition of impairments gained during service that left the often young pensioners bereft of other opportunities. Other institutions, such as the London Foundling Hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, Barbados Dispensary, offered free care to the laboring poor in exchange for access to the recipient's labor, either at that moment in terms of labor and service to the institution, or in the future in the case of children or infants at the Foundling Hospital or the Marine Society. Nurses and surgeons aboard ships and in hospitals faced occupational risks to their health that could become chronic or impairing and often went uncompensated. So the history of care work reveals myriad complexities when we consider medical care within the labor context of transoceanic empires, especially if we consider historical actors often omitted from these histories, namely children, pregnant women, and the impaired. And now wrapping up, the COVID-19 pandemic certainly gave new visibility to these questions and elevated the struggles of healthcare workers and the disparate patient outcomes of the American healthcare system into the national consciousness. Yet the urgency of the recent crisis, I think, obscures a deeper historical reality that these questions are not new and they have been answered in various ways before. Again, a cornerstone of my research and across my published work is that science and medicine are primarily human experiences that require analysis of their social, cultural, economic, and political contexts despite long-standing efforts to frame them as somehow above such concerns. And by exploring the factors that shaped an earlier care economy, or an earlier medicine trade in the case of my first book, that exploited the work of the vulnerable, both as workers, patients, or as recipients of medicine, we can better understand the inequalities at the root of the healthcare industry and hopefully begin to think about alternatives. So, thank you very much.
Dr. Dorner, thank you for this very excellent talk today about your book. We are going to stop the recording and then we will start the question and answer session.